You ever have one of those moments where life slows down just enough for you to actually see what's around you? Like you're sitting in your living room with the TV on low, or maybe you're waiting for your coffee order, or you're just parked somewhere for a minute because you needed to breathe, and suddenly something hits you. You look around and realize there are more men sitting by themselves than you ever remember seeing when you were younger. Men in their 40s, 50s, 60s, reading a book alone, eating alone, driving alone, just existing, and they don't look miserable. They don't look broken. They look calm, settled, almost like they stepped out of the script everyone else is still reading from, and found their own quiet lane. And you think, that's interesting, because 20 or 30 years ago, seeing a man alone like that almost felt unusual. Now, it feels normal, expected, like the world shifted while nobody was paying attention. And the funny thing, is that people still don't talk about it out loud. You hear little hints in conversations, like someone mentioning an uncle who never remarried after his divorce, or a friend who says he's happier living by himself, or a coworker who quietly admits he's not interested in dating anymore. But it's always brushed aside, treated like a small detail instead of a sign of something bigger. Nobody ever stops and goes, wait, why is this happening? Because the truth is, the reasons men stay single today have almost nothing to do with what people assume. It's not fear, it's not immaturity, it's not bitterness toward women. It's something deeper, something older men especially understand because they've lived enough years to see how relationships actually play out, not the fantasy, not the fairy tale, but the real version behind closed doors. And that's really what we're talking about today, not in an angry tone, not in a blaming tone, just honestly, because when you've watched marriages fall apart, when you've seen men lose their savings, their confidence, their identity, when you've witnessed friends or family go through heartbreak that rearrange their entire life, you start to understand why some men step back and say, maybe not. Not because they don't want love, but because they finally see the price tags that come attached to it emotionally, financially, mentally. And once you see the whole picture, it becomes harder to ignore the reality that staying single is sometimes not a failure at all. Sometimes it's wisdom. Sometimes it's self-preservation. Sometimes it's the first time in a man's life that he's chosen himself instead of following everyone else's expectations. And a big part of that conversation, whether people like to admit it or not, starts with money. I know it sounds cold to even bring it up, but older men understand something younger guys don't learn until it's too late. Money isn't just paper. It's security. It's peace of mind. It's the ability to sleep at night without feeling that tight knot in your chest. When men look at the modern landscape, the divorce courts, the legal system, the financial fallout they've watched happen to people they know, the calculation that becomes painfully clear. In the past, marriage was simple. You moved in with someone. You shared your life, your expenses, your future. Now, for a man, marriage can feel like stepping into a high-risk contract where the potential losses are massive, and the guarantees, they aren't really there. And the thing is, men don't have to read statistics to understand this. They've lived it. They've watched friends lose houses they spent decades paying for. They've watched coworkers drained by alimony payments. They've seen family members split their retirement savings after 20 years of work. And what makes it even heavier is that even the so-called good marriages, the ones that don't fall apart, still often place the financial weight on the man's shoulders. Vacations. He pays the nicer car. He covers it. Emergencies, bills, upgrades, expectations, they mysteriously land on him too. And after years of that, years of carrying responsibility with hardly any acknowledgement, a man can look at the whole setup and quietly think, do I really want to sign up for this again? So when you ask an older man today why he isn't dating seriously, why he isn't rushing to remarry, why he feels strangely comfortable living in his own quiet apartment with his own predictable expenses, and nobody draining his bank account or his energy, he'll give that little smile, maybe rub the back of his neck, and say something like, it's just not worth the risk anymore. And the truth is, whether people want to admit it or He's not wrong. The thing people don't understand, especially people who haven't lived enough life yet, is that men don't wake up one day and decide, I'm done with relationships. It doesn't happen suddenly. It happens slowly over years, over disappointments, over trying to be the bigger person, the patient one, the stable one, the one who keeps the peace even when he's crumbling inside. It happens after sitting through arguments he didn't start, after giving apologies for things he didn't do, after having his efforts overlooked and his mistakes magnified. You can only hold that emotional weight for so long before something inside you quietly snaps. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just a gentle click in the back of your mind that says, I'm tired of feeling tired. And once that moment happens, it's almost impossible to unfeel it. It changes how a man sees relationships forever. And what makes it more complicated, is the way modern relationships have shifted emotionally. Men aren't allowed to feel much anymore. A man expresses stress, and he's negative. A man needs a break, and he's pulling away. A man asks for space, and suddenly he's the villain in a story he didn't. To even know he was in everything a man feels gets filtered through someone else's emotional lens, judged, interpreted, twisted into something it isn't. So what does he do? He stops sharing. He becomes quieter. He turns internal. And once a man becomes internal, and once he switches off that external emotional connection, good luck getting him to open back up again. Because once you learn that your emotions only create more problems, you stop giving people access to them. Older men understand this deeply because they've lived it long enough to see the pattern. When they were younger, they tried, they communicated, they shared, they did everything they were told would fix things. But with time, they learned that being open sometimes just gave someone more ammunition. And the older you get, the less energy you have for emotional landmines. You don't want to decode moods anymore. You don't want to guess what's wrong. You don't want to tiptoe around someone's inner storms. You just want peace, not silence, not isolation. Just the absence of chaos. And for a lot of men, that silence, that quiet, predictable, steady rhythm of their own life becomes priceless. What makes all of this even heavier is the way relationships slowly shape you without you realizing it. You don't walk into one thinking, I'm going to lose myself, but it happens inch by inch. First, you stop doing a hobby because it takes too much time. Then you see friends less often because it creates tension. Then you start adjusting your personality, your opinions, your reactions just to avoid the next argument. And before you know it, the things that once made you, but you are gone. Not stolen, not ripped away, just slowly sanded down until you look in the mirror and think, who exactly am I at this point? And the wild thing is, society celebrates this. They call it compromise. They call it maturity. But it's only compromise when both people bend. Most men bend until they're folded in half. So when these men finally find themselves single again, whether by choice or by circumstance, something unexpected happens. They rediscover themselves, not all at once, but in little pieces, like remembering what kind of music they actually like, or picking up a forgotten hobby, or realizing they're funnier than they were allowed to be. There's the sense of resurrection, like they're slowly rebuilding a version of themselves they lost years ago, and the thought of giving that up again. For many men, it's not worth it. Not because they hate relationships, but because they're finally meeting themselves again after years of being someone else. Edited version. Another thing that pushes men towards solitude is the exhaustion, and I mean the bone-deep exhaustion, of always being the responsible one, the stable one, the one who has to stay composed when everything else is falling apart. People don't realize how tiring that role is because men rarely complain about it. They don't have the space to. Men are taught early on that their value comes from what they provide, how calm they remain, how much weight they can carry without crumbling, so they carry, and then society looks at them and says, why don't you open up more, while simultaneously punishing them every time they actually do. It's a no-win game, and men are tired of playing it. So when a man finally gets his own space, his own small apartment, his own car, his own quiet routines. He starts to breathe differently. His shoulders drop. His mind unclenches. He cooks what he wants, sleeps when he wants, spends his money how he wants. He doesn't have to report where he's going. He doesn't have to justify why he's tired. He doesn't have to argue about something that doesn't matter. He gets to be a person with preferences, again, and that freedom, that autonomy, that feeling of owning your own life. Once a man tastes that, he becomes very careful about ever giving it up again. And then there's this unspoken reality that men rarely admit out loud, but every man feels deeply. They've seen too many men lose everything to relationships that promised stability but delivered disaster. They've watched divorces that tore families apart. They've watched financial ruin. They've watched emotional collapse. They've watched strong men become shadows of themselves because they tied their entire life to someone who didn't respect the weight of that responsibility. And when you witness enough of that, whether through family, friends, co-workers, something inside you changes. You stop rushing into things. You stop romanticizing commitment. You start protecting yourself. Not because you're paranoid, but because experience taught you what fantasy never could. And another thing that pushes men towards staying single, and people really underestimate this, is how hard it is to rebuild yourself once you've been broken down by the wrong relationship. It's not like losing a job or failing a class or having an argument with someone. Those things sting, sure, but you bounce back. But losing yourself in a relationship, that's a slower kind of damage. It's subtle. It's quiet. It's almost invisible until it's done. When a man gives and gives and bends and compromises and tries to keep the peace for so long that he forgets what his own voice sounds like, coming back from, that takes time, a lot of time. And when a man finally puts in the work to put himself back together, when he rebuilds his confidence, his stability, his sense of self, he becomes very protective over that progress. He starts to see his own peace like something fragile, something he can't afford to lose again. And that makes him cautious, not scared, cautious. There's a difference. And this caution makes relationships feel heavier than they once did. When you're young, you go into them blind, hopeful, maybe even a little clueless, but in a good way. You're not thinking about emotional erosion or financial risks or long-term compatibility. You're just living moment to moment. But once you've been through enough in life, you start walking into situations with your eyes wide open. You see red flags faster. You notice patterns quicker. You don't lie to yourself the way you used to. You don't romanticize chaos. And that awareness, that clarity, makes commitments harder because now you're making decisions with the full weight of your past experience sitting on your shoulders. You're comparing what you have now with what you survived back then. And if anything feels even remotely similar, you pull back, you retreat into yourself. You say, I've been here before and I didn't like what happened last time. And people will call that fear. But it isn't fear. It's memory. It's wisdom wearing scars. It's self-preservation dressed up as hesitation. The truth is, men don't forget the pain they went through. They don't forget the nights they couldn't sleep because their mind was spinning, or the mornings they woke up already tired because life at home felt like walking through a minefield. Those experiences, they tucked somewhere in the back of a man's mind, and he uses them consciously or unconsciously to protect himself from ever feeling that depleted again. That's not cowardice. That's survival instinct. Another layer to this, and it's something people rarely acknowledge, is that men aren't as bothered by solitude as everyone assumes. The world paints this picture of the lonely single man eating frozen meals by himself, staring at a blank wall, waiting for someone to save him from his existence. But that's not reality anymore. Men today fill their time with purpose. They work on themselves. They get into hobbies. They spend time outdoors. They improve their health. They build projects that give them pride. They read. They learn. They fix things, and in the process they create a life that feels meaningful, not dependent on a relationship to feel complete. It's not that they don't want connection. It's that they no longer feel empty without it. And here's the thing, and this surprises a lot of people, a man who becomes comfortable in his own company becomes incredibly selective about who he lets into his life. When a man has peace, he won't trade it for excitement. When he has stability, he won't trade it for drama disguised as passion. When he has purpose, he won't trade it for someone who drains him. Men who have built a good life for themselves aren't opposed to love. They're opposed to losing themselves. Again, they learned the hard way that love isn't supposed to feel like a gamble. It's supposed to feel like alignment. And as men get older, the meaning of companionship changes too. It's not about building a family anymore. Many already did that or decided not to. It's not about proving anything to society. Older men no longer care what people think. What they care about is the quality of their days, the feeling they carry in their chest, the quiet moments when nobody's watching. They care about waking up without dread. They care about having energy left for themselves. They care about having someone who adds peace, not someone who needs to be managed like another responsibility. And because the pool of people who actually bring that kind of calm gets smaller with age, the likelihood of a man choosing single life grows. And honestly, there's a kind of dignity in that choice. People don't talk about it enough, but there's something powerful about a man deciding to live life on his own terms, even if it means walking alone. There's something honest about saying, I'd rather be by myself than shrink myself for someone else. There's something admirable about a man who refuses to sign up for unhappiness just because society says he's supposed to. And the older men get, the less patience they have for expectations that make no sense. The less guilt they feel about choosing their own well-being, the less interested they become in chasing validation. What men want, deep down, quietly, privately, is simple peace, purpose, stability, respect, not constant emotional fires to put out, not endless debates, not being told who they should be, not feeling like they're always one mistake away from losing everything. They want a life that feels manageable, a life that feels like theirs. And if a relationship enhances that, great. If it doesn't, they walk away. Not out of bitterness, but out of clarity. And that's usually the moment when the world looks at them and asks, why are you still single? But the truth is, most of these men aren't still single. They're choosing to be, actively, intentionally, thoughtfully, because somewhere along the way, after years of living, loving, losing, rebuilding, and learning the truth the hard way, they finally realized they don't need a relationship to feel complete. They just need something or someone who doesn't cost them their peace. And the more you really sit with this whole thing, the more you notice how men, especially as they grow into their 40s and 50s and beyond, start shifting their priorities in ways they never expected when they were younger. When you're in your 20s, everything feels like it has to happen fast. Relationships, marriage, proving yourself, building something with someone before time runs out. But once a man has lived long enough, once he's had enough late nights, staring at the ceiling, wondering how his life drifted so far from what he imagined, he starts realizing that time isn't something you race against. It's something you protect. And that protection becomes almost sacred. He becomes careful about where his mental energy goes, who has access to him, who can disrupt his peace. He stops letting people into his life just because he's afraid of being alone. And honestly, that's when solitude stops feeling like emptiness and starts feeling like ownership. Ownership of his schedule, his moods, his priorities, his space. And it's strange because men don't get credit for that kind of growth. They're expected to always be the steady ones, the unshakable ones, the providers, the problem solvers, the emotional anchors, the pillars, the reliable ones. Society forgets that men are human beings with internal lives that get tired, that ache, that long for rest. So when a man finally decides, you know what, I don't want to live like that anymore, people label him closed off or emotionally unavailable. But what they're missing, what they never think about, is that maybe he's not unavailable at all. Maybe he's simply done giving everything to people who give almost nothing back. Maybe he's done being the foundation for everyone else's needs while nobody supports his. And the more you talk to older men, the more you realize that one of their biggest fears isn't being alone. It's losing themselves again. It's waking up 10 years into a relationship and seeing a stranger in the mirror. It's realizing they've given away their peace, their identity, their hobbies, their spark, their laughter, their ambitions, one compromise at a time. A man can survive heartbreak. He can survive disappointment. He can survive starting over from scratch, but losing himself, that's the one thing he never fully recovers from. So, once he rebuilds himself, the idea of giving someone else that level of influence over his life again feels almost dangerous. And then there's this deeper, quieter truth that men rarely say out loud because it feels too vulnerable, too revealing, but it sits in their chest like a weight. They know how fragile happiness can be. When you're young, you think good days are endless and problems are temporary. But once you've lived long enough, you learn that happiness is something you have to actively maintain, something that can slip through your fingers if you're not careful. So when a man finds a version of happiness that doesn't leave him drained or confused or constantly questioning himself, he guards it with everything he has. He builds routines that protect it. He builds boundaries that preserve it. He builds a life that doesn't require him to constantly repair or defend his own joy. And stepping back into a relationship feels like opening the gate to something that could easily take all of that away. It's not that men don't want companionship. They do. It's not that they don't crave closeness or intimacy or someone to share moments with, but older men understand that companionship without peace is just another form of stress. Intimacy without respect is just another form of loneliness. A relationship without emotional balance is just another burden, disguised as love. And men who have lived through lopsided relationships are no longer fooled by the surface-level sparkle. They can sense instability. Now they can feel emotional volatility even before it starts. They can spot manipulation, guilt-tripping, blame-shifting, silent punishment, or shifting expectations faster than ever. And instead of fighting through it, instead of trying to fix someone else's storms, they quietly step away, not out of fear, but out of wisdom. And underneath all of this, there's something almost philosophical happening in men today, especially older men. They're redefining what it means to live a good life. It used to be marriage, kids, a house, and a job until retirement. That was the formula. That was the meaning. But now men are realizing that a good life might simply be a peaceful one, a purposeful one, a life where they wake up without dread, a life where they're not performing emotional labor from morning till night, a life where they get to choose what matters and what doesn't. For the first time, men are understanding that the traditional path isn't the only path. And for some, it wasn't even the right path in the first place. And what really surprises people is how content older, single men actually are. They built their routines. The morning coffee exactly the way they like it. The quiet evenings, strolling through whatever interests them, the workouts, the little projects around the house, the hobbies that make them feel alive. They take drives with their favorite music. They go fishing or hiking or gaming or whatever it is that reconnects them with themselves, and they feel centered, balanced, not judged, not interrupted, not pulled in a dozen emotional directions, just grounded in their own life, their own choices, their own rhythm. And once a man finds that rhythm, it's almost impossible to convince him that giving it up is worth the risk. And at the end of the day, after all the experiences, the disappointments, the lessons, the rebuilding men come to a simple truth. Being single is not a void. It's not a failure. It's not a sign that something's lacking. Sometimes it's the first time in a man's life that he's actually living in alignment with who he is, not who he was told to be. And if someone comes along who fits into that peace without disturbing it, he'll let them in gladly. But if they don't, if they bring chaos or conflict or pressure or unrealistic expectations, he'll choose himself every time. But there's another part of this conversation that almost never gets talked about, and honestly, it might be the most revealing of all. As men reach a certain age, they begin to notice how their internal world changes. There comes a point where the noise that once filled their life, the expectations, the pressure, the comparisons, the need to prove something, it starts getting quieter. Not because life gets easier, but because men stop living for applause. They stop measuring their happiness. Well, they fit into someone else's plans. And when a man stops chasing approval, he starts hearing something he ignored for years. His own voice. That voice isn't loud. It's almost like a low hum in the back of the mind. What do you want? What actually feels right to you? And the older a man gets, the more honest that voice becomes. It points him in directions he overlooked. It tells him the truth about people he once tried to impress. It shows him which choices drained him and which choices kept him grounded. And listening to that voice takes courage, because once you hear it clearly, you can't unhear it. You can't go back to performing. You can't pretend you don't know better anymore. And that awareness creates a new kind of discipline in a man, a discipline that makes him selective in ways he never was before. And, something interesting happens when a man becomes selective. His world gets smaller, but it also gets better. He stops entertaining people who drain his time. He stops saying yes to situations that leave him feeling worse. He stops tolerating relationships that bend him out of shape. Instead, he starts gravitating toward environments where he feels understood. Without having to explain himself, he chooses people who respect his boundaries without turning it into a fight. He makes room for quiet moments that used to scare him, but now feel like restoration. And in those moments, he realizes something surprising. He doesn't need constant company. He needs genuine connection, and those two things are not the same. And with age comes another shift, a deeper, almost existential awareness of how fragile life really is. Men see friends pass away unexpectedly. They hear about health scares. They watch people their age dealing with things nobody warned them about. And there's something about that reality that makes a man more intentional. He starts asking questions he never thought to ask before. If I only have so many years left, how do I want to spend them? Where do I want my energy to go? Who feels like home and who feels like work? Those questions cut right through the illusions we grew up believing. They make men look at their life with a brutal honesty. And honesty has a way of reshaping priorities fast. And along with that honesty comes a gentler understanding of relationships themselves. Older men don't idealize romance anymore. They don't believe love alone solves problems. They don't confuse intensity with stability. They've lived long enough to know that real connection is quiet, steady, consistent, and never demanding more than someone can give. And when men talk about love at an older age, they describe it differently. It's not butterflies or chaos or constant passion. It's presence. It's ease. It's the absence of tension. It's someone they can sit next to in silence without feeling responsible for filling the air. It's someone whose presence doesn't feel like pressure. And the truth is, companionship changes shape as men age. It becomes less about building a future and more about sharing the present. Less about filling a void, and more about enriching a life that already feels complete. Men don't look for someone to complete them. They look for someone who doesn't complicate what they've already built. And because that kind of connection is rare, a man would rather wait for the right one, even if the wait lasts the rest of his life, than settle into something that chips away at the peace he fought so hard for. What people misunderstand is that single men aren't rejecting love. They're rejecting the conditions that come with the wrong kind of love. They're rejecting the emotional weight that breaks them down. They're rejecting the unbalanced expectations that slowly crush their spirit. They're rejecting the idea that suffering is the price of companionship. And once a man knows he can stand on his own, truly stand, he stops accepting relationships that require him to shrink. And maybe that's the part people should admire. Not mock, not question, not shame. Because a man choosing solitude isn't choosing isolation. He's choosing self-awareness. He's choosing the version of life that aligns with his inner truth. even when that truth doesn't match what society says he should want. He's choosing to honor the lessons that shaped him instead of repeating mistakes that hurt him. In the end, men don't stay single because they're afraid of commitment. They stay single because they're finally committed to themselves. They've learned that peace isn't a luxury, it's a responsibility. Their time isn't cheap anymore. Their energy isn't limitless. Their identity isn't negotiable. And if love returns to their life, it has to arrive gently, respectfully, calmly, without taking more than it gives, without asking them to sacrifice the person they worked so hard to become. And if it doesn't, if love never comes in the right form, then these men still live full, grounded, meaningful lives. They laugh, they learn, they grow, they find purpose in work, hobbies, friendships, quiet mornings, long drives, and the kind of inner stillness they never had when they were younger. And there's something beautiful about that, something quietly powerful, because a man who chooses peace over pressure isn't lost. He isn't incomplete. He isn't broken. He's finally becoming whole.